All right, hello folks, it's that time once again. My name is Alan and let's talk metal. And tonight we're not talking about just any metal, we're talking about one of my five most favorite bands of all time, and this is New York's legendary Riot. Now, there's been tons of documentaries and things made about Riot. I'm not going to try to go through every little detail of their history. The band has been around since the late 70s. It's 40 years worth of stuff to track down. I'll put some links in the comments below if you want to check out some of the really good documentaries that have been posted. They have lots of interviews. A lot of the old band members have been tracked down. So it's great watching if you're really into the band. Tonight, I'm just going to focus on kind of going through their discography, talking about a lot of the different albums. I don't have their entire discography. There are a few holes that I haven't filled in just yet with the Riot catalog. Some of them are going to surprise you. But I wanted to talk about this band not just because it's one of my favorites, but because they're also a band that a lot of people still sort of overlook or misunderstand. The band has gone through a lot of changes during that 40-year history. They've had multiple lead singers and they've played very different styles of music. Someone in a recent video commented that they've heard two or three Riot albums and everyone sounds like it's a completely different band, and it leads to a lot of confusion around the band. Sometimes it's like, wait, is this album by that same Riot or is this some other Riot? There's been a name change in recent years, which didn't help clarify matters any. So I'm going to sort of just work our way through the catalog tonight and give you my thoughts and opinions about some excellent stuff. I feel they've been one of the most consistent bands over time in terms of putting out quality material. Despite all the lineup changes, despite all the style shifts, they've almost always been putting out really great stuff. So without further ado, let's get started with one of my favorites in their entire catalog. It's their debut from 1977, and it is this album, Riot Rock City. It is the album that introduces the infamous seal man mascot, Tior the Mighty, or that seal thing, as a lot of folks tend to know it. So Riot's coming out of New York. This is 1977. And this is a 70s hard rock album in a lot of ways. But it's also a wave of that late 70s hard rock that's a little more energetic and a little more upbeat, has a little more punch to it than a lot of material did through the 1970s. This is not the dinosaur rock of the early and mid 70s that people had kind of gotten bored with. This is definitely punching things up a lot. Riot, of course, was sort of the brainchild of guitarist Mark Reale, who has since passed away. And right away on this album, they established, a really solid, guitar attack sound. The vocals of Guy Speranza fit the album really, really well. Every song on here is a classic. Of all the old Riot albums, this is easily the one I play the most. I go back to this album. I never get tired of it. I've been playing it for 25, 30 years now, and I can still put this on, sing along to every song, love it from start to finish. I think it's the best of the first era of Riot. Riot's eras tend to be defined by their vocalist, and they often accompany style shifts. And again, with Guy Speranza, yeah, you're getting this sort of powerful sounding late 70s hard rock vibe. They're definitely presaging what's going to happen as we get into the end of the 70s and the early 80s, with hard rock bands shifting into more of a heavy metal track. But yeah, this has all kinds of killers on it, with Overdrive being one of the outstanding tracks. But everything on here is excellent material, very lively, fun album, and a great listen. The band would follow it up 2 years later in '79 with an album called Norita. A couple of lineup changes happen along the way. I do not have a copy of this album. I've owned it in the past, and while it's consistent with the style they had established on their debut, it just kind of lacks the standout tracks in my mind. There are some good ones, especially on the B side of that album, but for whatever reason, the album never quite clicked with me the same way that Rock City did. And as such, it's not an album I've kept around in hard copy. I've been pretty happy just having digital files of that one. So they do Narita. It's a decent album. And then 2 years later, so kind of on a 2-year rotation here, you get to 1981, and they release one of their signature albums, which is Fire Down Under. And this is the third and last of the Guy Speranza era albums. And this is the one that brings you three absolute classics from the Riot discography. You get the title track, Fire Down Under, which is raging proto power metal stomper. You get the anthem Swords and Tequila, which, if most people know only one Riot song, it's probably going to be that one, and it is a barn burner of a track. And you also get the masterpiece Outlaw, which, again, a little more mid-paced song, and shows off a little bit of a bluesy quality to it, but it's an excellent track nonetheless. You have 5-star tracks, 1, 2, 3, all on side A. So makes for a great listen on side A. My one problem with that album has always been that the other 5 or so tracks are very average, in my opinion. They just, they're not bad, but they go past, and they've never really made a heavy impression on me one way or the other. I've heard lots of live versions of those tracks. I have lots of concert recordings of the band from that era, and those songs always just sound very interchangeable to me. It's why I don't actually have a hard copy of Fire Down Under at this point. I've had it in the past, and it's one of those albums where I just, would always spot track it. I wanted to play those 3 songs, and the rest of the album, I just would move on and play something else. So I just have Fire Down Under in digital form. Kind of heresy, I know, for a self-admitted Riot fan. It's an album I would pick back up sometime. Every time I see it nowadays, people want kind of a silly price for it. And I'm not going to pay ridiculous money for an album that I really only love 3 songs off of. And the rest of the album, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's filler material, but none of those songs are particularly memorable, in my opinion. But again, it's very consistent with the style they've had on their earlier albums. Sounds great. But it brings the Guy Speranza era of the band to a close. They'd never established a real stable lineup, and even though they were getting albums out and touring, uh, the band was only going so far. So things wrap up there. And sorry if I have to glance over here every now and then, but again, their discography is extensive. Trying to make sure I get years and such right and don't miss anything. And so, yeah, even though their vocalist is gone, they come right back the next year and release album number 4. This one's called Restless Breed, and it features a new vocalist by the name of Rhett Forrester on it. I like Rhett Forrester's vocals a lot. He has a pretty tough sound, a little more of a bluesy sound also in his vocals at times. I think he's got a very powerful voice, and I've liked a lot of the material I've heard. He would later do some solo albums. He would also, a couple of years later, do the vocals on Jack Starr's solo album. This one, Out of the Darkness. This is after Jack had been kicked out of Virgin Steel, and he did this one-off album with Rhett Forrester singing all the songs. And it's an excellent album. It's usually these kind of solo one-off projects, it can be pretty hit or miss, but yeah, there's a lot of great stuff on here. The song False Messiah is on here, played by Jag Panzer later on when they got back together in the 1990s. So yeah, Rhett's got a good voice. My problem with Restless Breed is the songs, a lot of them don't quite come together. Feels like it was probably done in a hurry. The timeline would suggest that it was, that you have to get a new vocalist, write new material, get the songs together, and the album's out, the following calendar year. And there's a lot of songs on the albums that just, they're not my favorites. Among the entire Riot catalog, this is probably my least favorite album by the band. There's still some good stuff on it. Some of the more powerful songs like Lone Shark are pretty good. But there's also some pretty almost dippy sounding ones, like Loved by You and stuff. The songs just don't go anywhere. It's got horrible artwork. It's the one where you got like the little schoolboy and half his face just looks like some bratty kid, and the other half is supposed to look like a werewolf. But it's like prepubescent teen wolf. with like bad airbrush art, yeah, it doesn't work. So, yeah, Restless Breed, I would consider overall to be sort of a rare miss in the band's catalog, and I'm willing to chalk it up to them just being rushed, trying to keep momentum and not lose too much of what head start they had on things after the vocalist change had to occur. They keep pushing right along, and in 1983, they get their second album out with Rhett Forrester still on vocals, and this one's called Born in America. And this is an excellent album. Now, by this point, everything clicks and comes together, and the band sounds really good, really forceful. There's no drastic stylistic shift between what the band was doing with Rhett and what the band was doing with Guy. Uh, but this album, the songs click and they really fire off well. There's a lot of very good ones on here. There's an excellent cover of the old song Devil Woman, where Rhett gets to use a little bit of that bluesy crooning voice he's so good at. You've got Running from the Law. You Burn in Me is a real smoldering number with a great climbing guitar line in it. Gunfighter's good. Lots and lots of tracks. And it's interesting because I think this is one of the least known albums in their catalog. If you ask a lot of fans who've heard, multiple Riot albums, like, hey, what do you think of this one? A lot of them will be like, oh, that's one I've never actually heard. So somehow this album went overlooked, and it might be because this was the last album the band would put out for several years. So again, they've churned out several albums, 3 years in a row here, 81, 82, 83. And at that point, the wheels came off and the band fell apart. So again, Rhett Forrester went on and did the album with Jack Starr, did solo stuff. Other members went in different directions. By this time, the band had, sort of connections established down in Texas. Mark Raleigh would spend time in San Antonio and eventually would get the band back together with a very different lineup and in a very different direction. So we're kind of at the end of the Mark II era of Riot. But again, Born in America is one not to overlook. It really is the better of those Rhett Forrester albums, in my opinion. I know a lot of people would disagree with that. Restless Breed, some folks really dig. It's just never quite clicked with me the way Born in America does. So Mark Raleigh starts to build up a new roster. He recruits Don Van Stavern out of San Antonio Legends Slayer, the San Antonio Slayer, not the California one, of course, and not the Arizona one either. Slayer was a popular band name around that time. But yeah, he gets Van Stavern to join on bass. He gets the legendary Bobby Jarzombeck interested on drums. Mark Edwards is also in the band on drums around that time. So the band is coming together, and they get a new vocalist by the name of Tony Moore, who was in vocal school, learning to be a trained singer. And in 1988, the band kind of comes back out of nowhere with this album, Thundersteel. This might be one of my 5 most favorite albums of the entire decade. It's a weird release in some ways, because again, the band's been gone for years. You check out the picture on the back, and they're definitely not going for that sort of, hard rock image anymore. They're not going for the bluesy influences, from the Guy or Rhett era. The picture is a little hairy, shall we say. But the music on here is full throttle power metal. I'd say it's European style power metal, but really there weren't many European bands playing this type of power metal yet. Halloween Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1 had only come out the year before, in 1987. So you had some bands operating in that style, and it seems Riot was latching onto that and going in this very amped up speed metal, power metal direction. And the album is an absolute barn burner from the opening riffs almost all the way to the very end. This is one of those albums I would rank an A+. If I had to make one little point deduction, I think the last 2 songs on it, they run out of gas a little bit. But those first 7 tracks in a row are absolute classics. They are killers. all of that praise said, it is a little bit of a divisive album in their catalog. Folks who are big fans of the earlier albums aren't very keen on this one sometimes because to them it does not sound at all like Riot, and they feel like it shouldn't have been released under the name Riot. The band's it's a completely new lineup except for Mark. The style is completely different. Why not change the name and get a completely fresh start? Well, it didn't work out that way. Mark and Company would follow it up 2 years later with an album in a similar vein that's not nearly as well known. And it's this one, 1990's The Privilege of Power. Yes, it has a very goofy, sort of cartoonish cover that did it no favors. This album has some strong points and some weak points to it. Again, it's following up in that same over-the-top, very high-speed power metal style of Thundersteel. And a lot of the tracks on here could easily have been on Thundersteel. There's a lot of excellent high-velocity power metal on here. It does have a little more of a varied approach. There are some more mid-pace songs. There are some almost poppy, ballady type songs, but they actually work fairly well as long as you're not really, really put off by those types of songs. So even though you've got some different sounding tracks on here, I think it mixes things up pretty well. And I really like those songs. They're very, very catchy. They'll get stuck in your head whether you want them to or not. One of the things that was kind of odd about this album, though, is in between the songs, there are lots of these little snippets of different like TV shows and such. It was kind of like the band was sort of making it into a concept album. So you keep getting these 30-second and 60-second intros and outros of what sounds like different news channel discussions talking about how some the big shadow corporations are pulling strings behind the scenes. There are certain clips where people are kind of monotonely rattling off this list of companies like DuPont and others, and how each of them contributed different components to making thermonuclear detonators, and we're through the looking glass here, folks. They're all in on it stuff. In later interviews, some of the band members said they actually were unaware any of that stuff was going to be put on this album, that it was an idea of their manager and or producer to add all that stuff after the band had left the studio. And so when they got the album and heard it, they, like everybody else, were like, what the hell is this? Where did this come from? And from the other side of that, the folks that put it on there felt like they were trying to give the band something a little more unique, that they in particular wanted to follow up on the success of Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime that had played with, a little bit of that same kind of, looking into the, media and, the deep state and blah, 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 and all that stuff, because that obviously had clicked and done well for Queensryche. And they felt like that was going to be the future for this style of metal, that just playing, fast songs like, with song titles like, Black Leather and Glistening Steel wasn't going to help Riot stand out enough in what was becoming a very crowded marketplace. And so they added all these other sort of accoutrements to the album, which I don't think it hurts the album any. They annoy a lot of people, and I can see where they would. They don't really bother me much, but it is kind of a weird addition to the album. Nevertheless, I like the album a lot. I think it's a good follow-up to Thundersteel. There's still enough quality material on here to check out. But the band, again, sort of fell to pieces. There were a lot of issues about the band trying to get paid for the recordings on this album. It was so bad that at least I think 2 of the members basically had to go to like the New York Musicians Union just to get a check cut, so they had something to show for the hours they put in. It really didn't work out well. And as such, this marked the end of yet another era of the band. Tony Moore would go on his own way, and the name Riot would lay quiet for a few years. Didn't help any either. At this point, 1990 is right around that time when the music industry was starting to change. You get into, within a year after this, you have grunge becoming a big thing. You have Metallica and then Megadeth taking heavy metal in different directions. You have death metal as the new extreme thing. Interest in these kind of power speed bands really disappeared in the U.S. by and large. It became more of a European and Japanese thing, which is where the band maintained a good fan base. But in the U.S., yeah, folks weren't biting. And so we wait a few years, and the band would resurface. Let's double check the year. I always get the year wrong on this album. Yeah, 1993. Mark would come back with yet another lineup. So this is Mark IV of the band. Some new players on board, and an album called Nightbreaker shows up in Japan, which is this one here, kind of a weird cover. And this one, again, check because the lineups get real goofy here. So at this point, you have Mark Raleigh as the holdover, and this introduces a core lineup to the band that would become a stable, long-running unit for several albums to come. You have Mike Flintz and Pete Perez rounding out the strings section, and you have Bobby Jarzambek back on drums. Bobby would kind of be in and out of the band, so it's kind of like one album is Bobby, the next one would be a different drummer, back and forth. And the new addition on vocals is named Mike DeMeo. Mike was another guy out of New York, same as the band, and he had played in some smaller bands before. The only thing I have of Mike's pre-Riot days is there's this little sort of local compilation of New York bands on Arctic Records, and there's a band called Cameo on it, and Mike was the vocalist for Cameo, and it's spelled with a K because we always misspell our heavy metal band names. But yeah, so Mike had sung for Cameo before and got at least a track on this compilation. And then he turns up in Riot, and he kind of helps define the new sound of Riot. This album, again, didn't get pressed in the US at the time. It was pressed in Japan, and it also got a Japanese press, or sorry, that was the Japanese pressing. It also got pressed in Germany with a different cover and a slightly different track list. There's one or two numbers that are switched out here. So the bonus tracks are sort of, the difference. With Nightbreaker, the band kind of moves a little bit more back towards their early 80s sound. These are not, raging power metal albums the way that Thundersteel and Privilege of Power were. These albums have a little bit more of that heavy metal hard rock vibe. It's towing the line in between, but it's doing so in a very good fashion. There are still songs on here that can be pretty fast and pretty powerful, lean towards that sort of classic US power metal sound a little bit more, but then they can pull it back with more songs that have more of the hard rock anthemic sound to them. Mike's a very good vocalist. I like his work a lot. He would go on to sing with the band Master Plan after this and is still active in other projects as well. His voice tends to have like a sort of a very rich tone to it, very warm, can be kind of bluesy when he wants to, but not overly so. So yeah, really good sound to the band. The Nightbreaker release, in a way, I've seen some comments that it was really just meant to be a set of demo recordings, that it really was never meant to become a full-fledged album on its own. And the production on it would back that up. It's a little bit rough sounding. It doesn't sound like it was cleaned up a whole lot before release. But nevertheless, it's a really good set of songs. It did eventually get released in the US. It wasn't until about 99 when the band was on Metal Blade. And so Metal Blade finally gave it a US pressing with yet another cover and yet another alteration in the track list. So yeah, all three of these versions have slightly different songs included, which is why I own all three of them. That and the fact that I really do like this album. I thought it was very strong. This was some of the earliest material I heard from the DeMeo era of the band. I was just really impressed that they were, still doing such quality stuff. So with the new lineup, established. And again, it would be a relatively stable lineup. The band would keep things going. And again, just double checking years here. These are easy to get mixed up. But yeah, so in 1995, they would release what would certainly be the first official, meant to be an album by this lineup. And it's this one, Brethren of the Long House. This one is something of a concept album. It plays along with the Last of the Mohicans storyline quite a bit. It's well done. Again, Mike DeMeo sounds really good on the vocals here. The songs are put together very carefully, still using that sort of 90s hard rock metal sound and doing really good on it. The band is definitely establishing a great sound at this point. This is another one that didn't get a release in the US at the time. Would be reissued later on. But yeah, at this point, you could tell the band definitely had, a sound nailed down. And it was only going to be a matter of time until they started to get more attention. And that would happen by 97. Pretty sure this one's 97. That's not the right one. We're in the middle. Yes, 97. There we go. In 97, this one would come out. And this is where Riot got back on most people's radar with the Inishmore album. So this finally saw the band getting some domestic release again, as the band were signed to good old Metal Blade Records. And this album got really strong reviews at the time. People were very impressed with the overall sound. Yeah, as the name would suggest, they were playing with a little bit of sort of Irish themes here. It's not a full-blown concept album or anything, but they're working in a little bit of that sound here and there just to spice it up a bit. But excellent track list, start to finish. It's a good album. Mike DeMeo's in full form. The band is firing on all 8. And Riot's definitely back on the map. Everyone was aware of what was going on at this point with the band. They still had their best following in places like Japan. Japan was getting things like EPs with multiple exclusive tracks. This is one I picked up because it's got not just one but 2 tracks that were only released in Japan. It's got, was it 15 Rivers and see, Red Rain also, as well as Angel Eyes and Turning the Hands of Time. So yeah, even the leftover songs were good enough to have been album inclusions easily at this point. And so the band goes from strength to strength. Next album would be 2 years later, 1999. They are still on Metal Blade. And they put out what I think is a lot of people's favorite from this era, Sons of Society. And just in case anybody thought it was over, nope. Tior the Mighty is back in full force there. Album cover a little more power metal looking here. But again, very strong album here. This one maybe leans a little heavier than the previous ones. There's still songs that would be in that hard rock style, but maybe a little bit more of a kind of traditional metal, not quite power metal leaning to it. This one I rank just a little lower than some of the other Mike DeMeo era albums. It's an excellent release. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just in terms of the songs that stand out and get stuck in my head the most. This one doesn't have quite as many as some of the other albums do, but you still can't go wrong with it. As a Riot album, again, this is kind of when the band's at peak popularity for the second time in their career. They had their run in the early 80s. The Thundersteel and Privilege of Power albums, again, went overlooked at the time quite a bit. But now, the band is kind of seeing a resurgence in the late 90s. After Sons of Society, if I recall right, it takes them a few years to follow up again. Okay, 3 years, and you get the release of this album, Through the Storm. This one came out then in 2002. Same core lineup is in place. Double checking that for you. But yeah, you still have Mike DeMeo singing. You still have Flint, Perez, Mark Rayleigh on it. Bobby Rondinelli is the drummer on this one. I think it's the only Riot album he played drums on. I don't remember him being on any of the others. This one got a strange reaction when it came out. A lot of people did not seem very interested in this album. And the few times I saw folks review it or comment on it, they were kind of like, that one's, don't really care for that one. And I never really understood it because I think it's just as good as the other DeMaio era albums. The first 5 or 6 tracks on here, Turn the Tables, Lost Inside This World, Chains, Through the Storm, Let It Show, Burn the Sun, they sound just as good as the stuff on all the other albums. I never have understood why this one has this sort of more ho-hum opinion of it. You see it for whatever it's worth. That's reflected in the reviews on Metal Archives, which is what I've got pulled up here, double checking the years. But you look at albums like Inishmore, has 3 reviews at 80%. Sons of Society, 2 reviews at 85%. Nightbreaker, 4 reviews, 82%. Brethren of the Longhouse, 2 reviews, 83%. Then you get to Through the Storm, 2 reviews, 52%. It drops way off. And again, that's reflects conversations I've had about this album over the past almost 20 years since it came out, and I just don't get it. It's a good Riot album. I will say, if there's a knock against it, it loses the plot a little bit as it gets towards the end of the album. You've got, let's see, Only You Can Rock Me as a cover. Then you've got Isle of Shadows as an instrumental. And then you have an instrumental cover of Here Comes the Sun. So it is kind of a weak way to end the album. They probably needed to shuffle things around a little bit there. I don't know why a band ever puts 2 instrumentals back to back on an album. That's never a good idea. Yes, I'm talking to you, Satan, and Court in the Act. So yeah, the album does kind of lag a little bit at the end. But again, those first 6 songs or so, classic stuff. Killer material. If you've liked the other DeMaio era Riot albums, there's no reason not to check this one out. All right, now the DeMaio era of the band is not done, but their run on Metal Blade is. Again, that album didn't get a good response, and as such, they would part ways with the label. It would take them 4 years to get another album out, and for that album, it's Army of One, which came out in 2006. And as you might already be guessing based on the OB over here, this one didn't get any US interest. So it's very odd that for that window in the late 90s, the band was doing really good and gaining momentum in the US with Inishmore and Sons of Society, and then within a few years, it was all gone again. Even though nothing had really fundamentally changed, this still features that same core of, DeMaio, Reale, Flint's, Perez. I believe this one has Frank Gilchrist playing drums. Like I said, the drummers are almost as hard to keep track of as the Spinal Tap lineup. But yeah, let's double check it here real quick. Let's see. Yeah, Frank Gilchrist was the drummer on this one. Frank had previously played drums with Virgin Steel on a lot of their material. So again, there's the Jack Starr, Rhett Forrester connection with Virgin Steel earlier as well. Something else I didn't mention, but in the mid-90s, there was also a connection with Jag Panzer because Harry Conklin did record some demos with the band, and there was, a chance there's a little window where he could have ended up being the vocalist for Riot, which would have been very interesting, but that did not come to pass. But those demos are out there. So anyway, Army of One, this one, it's still a good album. There's still a lot of good songs on here. Relatively speaking, it might be the weakest of the DeMaio era albums. There's still several I like on here, but this one, the band is really getting back into sort of just, hard rock sound. There's nothing too forceful on here that I recall. Still a lot of decent songs, just not a lot of standout songs. And as such, you kind of got the feeling between losing the Metal Blade deal, the album being okay, but not one of their stronger, that things were going to change, and change yet again they did. So the band goes quiet for about 5 years, and during this window, things are coming up that Mark has some very serious health issues and such. So folks were kind of unsure what would happen with the band moving forward. And then in 2011, to sort of everyone's surprise, the band surfaces with another sort of lineup shift and an album called Immortal Soul. This album actually sort of gets the Thundersteel lineup back together mostly. Don Van Staveren re-enters the picture. They got Tony Moore back in. Mike Flint's is still in here, but you see Pete Perez exit at this point. I'm forgetting who plays drums on this one, if it's Jarzambek or someone else. This one does have Bobby Jarzambek credited on drums. Yep. What's actually missing from this album a little bit is Mark Reale. Still credited on the album, but it was no secret that at this point he was ill enough that he wasn't able to perform a whole lot, and so he contributed some material here and there, but a lot of it was him, working with the other members to put the album together, but he just wasn't able to perform much at this point. This album tries to recapture some of the Thundersteel era glory, but it's obviously a big gap since then. Tony Moore's voice sounds different by this point. It's not bad. There are some very good songs on here. There are some fun throwbacks, like the track Still Your Man plays off of one of the songs from the Thundersteel album with Johnny's Back. There are some songs on here that don't really come together all that well, in my opinion. Some just feel a little bit like they miss the mark. And it tends to be the ones that are, again, either more mid-paced or going for more of the hard rock sound. But yeah, the more forceful numbers on here sound good. Of note is the opening track, which is a self-titled song, Riot. When bands do a self-titled song, if the band isn't called Black Sabbath, that song can be kind of risky because you're obviously putting your own name on it. And for a band to do that this late in their career with sort of, putting a lineup back together, it struck a lot of people. It was really weird that they would lead off a new album with a revised, rejuvenated lineup and just call it Riot. And oh man, it's a barn burner of a song. It would have fit in with the Thundersteel and Privilege of Power years just perfect. What's it going to take to make you riot? And it's just full throttle goodness. So it's definitely worth checking out and hearing for sure. All right, not long after the album's release, Mark would sadly pass away. And of course, most folks kind of assumed that was going to be the end of Riot. But it turned out that's not quite the case. Mike Flint and Don Van Staveren company would keep things moving along. With the band a couple of years later, Frank Gilchrist shows back up on drums, and they bring in a couple of new guys, Nick Lee and Todd Michael Hall. Now, I believe Hall had sung with some other projects. Jack Starr's Burning Star Band, which is still a going thing. He sang on several albums with them. But Flint's would rejuvenate the band about 2 years later. I believe this one's 2014. Again, let's double check. It's late. I'm tired, and they've got a lot of albums. But yeah, in 2014, so about 2 years after Mark's death, Riot would show back up for with the sort of fifth vocalist of their career as Riot V or Riot V. Again, sort of marking the fifth big change in lineup, fifth new vocalist of the band, and also to denote that this was an album that doesn't have Mark on it. At first, there was sort of a mixed reaction when folks heard this was coming out. It's just like, really, you guys going to do a Riot album without Mark Reale on it? How do we feel about that? But it came out quickly that Flint's they had talked to Mark's father, and his dad had really implored them to keep the band going. It was obviously Mark's lifelong body of work, and his dad didn't want to see that come to an end just because Mark had passed away. So with Mark's father's blessing, the band decided they would keep going, but they would make that change to the band name just to, make it clear that, there was a difference here. And so, yeah, you get Unleash the Fire, and it's a very good album. It leans more into the European power metal sound, not as high velocity as Thundersteel or anything like that, but it's definitely leaning more in that direction than the more hard rock stylings of the DeMeo era. So in a way, this is a little bit similar to Immortal Soul that had come before it. There's a lot of solid songs on here. It's a very good release. It's a worthy follow-up, and it's worthy of the Riot name, in my opinion. And then it would take them about 4 years, but they would get yet another album out under the Riot V or Riot 5 name with Armor of Light in 2018. And that's right, that damn seal will not go away anytime soon. It's often considered one of the corniest and, by some folks, one of the worst heavy metal mascots of all time. I love that seal. Don't talk trash about the seal. That seal is cooler than you or anybody you've ever known or loved in your life. But yeah, Armor of Light here picks right up where Unleash the Fire did. So again, you're getting what you would say is a good standard. It's fair to call this power metal by the standards of the late 90s and the 2000s. It still has its hard rock roots, for sure. This is not Hammerfall or Blind Guardian style power metal. It's more straightforward. It still has that blue collar appeal. They still have songs that are sort of throwbacks to some of their older stuff on here, which works just fine. There's no reason not to. Like songs like San Antonio, shouting back to Mark's days in Texas, and Don Van Staver's always been a mainstay in the metal scene there. So lots of good stuff here for sure. And that gets us to the end of the Riot discography. So things have been quiet in terms of new releases and new material for the past couple of years, but there have been a ton of compilations of old unreleased stuff put out. I think they've done 5 volumes. Let me check here again since we've got the window open. Yeah, they've already done Archives Volume 5, and that brings them up through the year 2005. So there might be at least one more archive volume to go. A lot of live stuff, demo recordings and such. I have not picked those up. One problem is they've released so many and they've come out so fast. Well, I can only handle so much, so I can't buy everything. Another thing is I already have a lot of old live recordings of Riot, especially from like the late 70s, early 80s period. So I don't really need a lot of that material. Riot has had a couple of live albums that they made throughout their career. Strangely, I don't feel they ever had a really great sounding live album. They either were very short albums or had very poor sound quality. There's a one, I think, recording the early 90s in Japan. It just sounds, the track list is awesome and the sound quality is awful. So yeah, it was one thing that was kind of missing from the band's career was that, one, Live After Death or, Strangers in the Night kind of, really top end Tokyo Tales quality level live album to showcase the band in the live environment, because they sound very, they could perform live great. It's just, the sound quality on the live recordings never really shown through. So that's another reason I haven't picked up a lot of these, different career compilation anthologies, at least at this point. There's a lot of them, and I have a feeling a lot of the material on them, sound quality wise, is going to be, even for someone who loves Riot as much as I do I need 5 volumes of that kind of material to try to wade through? For now, at least, I think I'm okay without them. But that takes care of it. So let's wrap this on up for the night, and then let's talk more Riot in the comments down below. Are you a fan of any of the 5 different eras of Riot more so than the other? Are you somebody who really doesn't like the stuff that came after Red Forrester? Or are you one of the fans that Thundersteel is your album and you're not interested in that old 70s stuff they did with Guy Speranza and the early 80s Red Forrester? Other than Swords and Tequila, what are your favorite Riot tracks? They've had a lot of great ones through the years, in my opinion. So leave a comment down below if you would, and we'll talk some more Riot. Until next time, I'm going to wrap this on up. Everybody stay safe and keep banging your heads.